Hi guys, Phil McGilvray here, founder of Grandma's Jars and passionate budget coach. In this video, I want to talk to you about the paycheck to paycheck cycle. During the week, I read some stats that said 1/3 of young Australians, so 18 to 34-year-olds, are living paycheck to paycheck and really struggling with debt. Now, this is a big issue that I see as a budget coach all the time is, well, I'm stuck in this cycle. How do I get out of it? How do I break this paycheck to paycheck cycle? So what I want to talk to you about today is, well, what is the paycheck cycle and why is it so hard to break out of? And so what I want to do for you is describe the cycle that I see my clients stuck in and give you a quick overview of, well, how do I get out of it? What do I need to do to get out of this cycle? Look, it can be a little bit confusing, but I'm hoping you understand what I'm trying to teach you through this video today. Okay, paycheck to paycheck, obviously that's when we've run out of money pretty much. We're on the verge of running out of money every time our next pay comes up. So we're hanging out for that next pay to pay the bills and to put petrol in the car and those sorts of things. And it's not a nice place to be. What's happening? Well, actually, let me take a step back. There's three places that you can put your income when it comes in, okay? The first, we've got our income coming into little smiley Fred here, and that income can either go to paying yesterday's expenses. So very often when we're stuck in the paycheck cycle, we've got overdue bills and expenses and we're late on paying the rent, and we're late on paying the mortgage, and the cupboard's completely empty, so we need to fill up the cupboard, the fridge. So yesterday's expenses. We've then got today's expenses, and that's the expenses that are turning up on our doorstep right here, right now, that we need to deal with. And very often this is, well, we do need to put food on the table. We do need to keep the lights on and pay the electricity bill. We do need to be able to cook, so we need to pay the gas bill and so on. And what happens typically is when we're stuck in the paycheck cycle is that all of our income is either going towards paying yesterday's expenses or getting us by and covering today's expenses. And again, very stressful place to live. And we're constantly trying to juggle which bill do we pay next, which is the most urgent. Now, the problem when we're stuck in this cycle is that, and this is why we get stuck in this cycle, is while we're dealing with today's expenses and paying for yesterday's expenses, we're not putting any money aside for our future expenses. So that means that when our future expenses do actually turn up, we don't have any money there to pay for them, and therefore our future expenses very quickly become yesterday's expenses that are sitting there overdue. And again, that can be very stressful. So what I always get my clients to do, the first thing I get them to do is to sit down and do a budget. And that budget is, here is my income. So this is what I know I earn on a monthly basis. And then we go through what all of their expenses are. And by all, I really mean all. Anything that you're going to have over the next 12 months needs to be considered in this budget. Now remember, our income is our upper limit of our spending. Our upper limit, we cannot spend more than what we earn. And then we put aside 1/12 of all our future expenses every month. And the goal, of course, is to make sure that our monthly income minus our monthly expenses leaves us with some surplus at the end of each month. We must have a surplus. So that is your first step, is we need to start having some margin in our lives that we can use to try and catch up. So firstly, you need to start with a budget so that you can identify and make that surplus reality every single month. The second step that we need to do is, once we've got a budget, we need to turn our thinking around, and instead of focusing on all of yesterday's bills and today's bills, now I know these need to be dealt with, but instead of dealing with these, what we want to start doing is, with our budget, putting aside 1/12 of all our future expenses. Because if we don't put aside for our future expenses will very quickly become today's expenses, and then today's expenses will very quickly become yesterday's expenses and sitting there ready to be paid or waiting to be paid. So what we want to start doing is putting aside 1/12 of all our future expenses. And the ideal scenario is that let's just say we earn $5,000 per month, and we're putting aside 1/12 of all our future expenses. Let's just say that takes $4,500. So we're putting that aside so that when our future expenses turn up, the money is sitting there ready to pay them. And what that means is that we're no longer feeding this cycle. These future expenses are no longer becoming today's expenses and yesterday's expenses, but we've cut off the cycle so that this is now as bad as it gets. So yesterday's expenses, we need to cover them, and today's expenses, we need to cover them, but we're starting to feed future expenses, and therefore we know that these aren't going to get any bigger. We know that yesterday's expenses aren't going to get any bigger because we're dealing with our future expenses as and when they turn up. The money is sitting there in our bank accounts to pay them. What we then do is the $500 that we've got surplus, we actually take that $500 and use that to start paying down yesterday's expenses. Now, we can actually identify the size of our shortfall by sitting down, adding up all of our expenses. What are these expenses that are due? Put them in a list. How much are they? We can also look at what are the expenses that are due today, and therefore, we start budgeting today, but it's too late because these ones are due right now. How much is there? You'll often find that it's a figure of, $2,000, $3,000. It's a lot of money, but it's not as much as people expect. And it's surprising because it's this $2,000 or $3,000 that keeps us trapped in this paycheck to paycheck cycle, because we're always putting our money over here and never over here. And once we can identify exactly how much our shortfall is, we can get really creative and proactive about, well, how do we fill this shortfall? Because now that we know that it's a finite amount, and we're no longer feeding it, we're no longer making it any bigger, we know that, let's say it's, $2,000, we can now get creative about, well, how can I find $2,000 to cover all these expenses that are here? And once I've got those covered, everything can then be channeled towards these future expenses. But in the short term, so we can be selling stuff, we could be taking on some part-time work, we could be doing a bit of overtime, just enough to try and deal with this shortfall. Once that shortfall is covered, we know that our income's enough to cover all our future expenses. And at that point, we've broken the cycle. But what it means you need to do is firstly budget, identify how much your income is, identify how much you need to be putting aside for 1/12 for your future expenses, and start putting that 1/12 aside, and then using your surplus to drip feed. Obviously you need to prioritize them and pay off these expenses as and when they turn up. Now, I know that sounds a lot easier than it really is to do, but this strategy works. You'd be surprised when you turn your thinking around, start focusing on tomorrow's expenses, and use your surplus to pay off yesterday's expenses. You'll very, very quickly get yourself out of that paycheck cycle and start building a strong financial future. So I'm hoping that some of that's made sense. I'm certain that you'll understand that, yes, I do put all my money at yesterday's expenses and just struggling with today's expenses, and nothing gets put aside for the future expenses, and that's why I'm stuck in the cycle. I'm sure you understand that. You'd be feeling that every day. But as I said to you, budget, and then start putting aside 1/12 of your future expenses and use what surplus is left and a bit of creativity to pay off your shortfall. I'm hoping that makes sense. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments section below this video. Again, I'm passionate about this. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We love helping people with this. We've been doing it for 15 years. So please ask us any questions. Subscribe to our channel. And I look forward to seeing you in our next tutorial.